The buyer's lawyer arrived with a document that had my name on it, written in a hand I recognized from the photographs. I drove back toward the city 3 days after the locked room and told myself it was over. The $50,000 had cleared. The second mortgage was breathing again. I had the footage, I had the documentation, and I had convinced myself. In that careful way you convince yourself of things you do not entirely believe, that Aldous Vrain was simply an eccentric woman with money and a peculiar property, and that I had done a job and been paid, and that was the whole of it. I went back to my apartment. I made coffee. I answered emails I had let go cold for a week. I was performing normalcy the way you perform it after something has shaken the floor beneath you, methodically, deliberately, with both hands on the counter. The thing about convincing yourself something is over is that reality does not consult your timeline. I had been back 4 days when the first letter arrived. Not a call, not an email, but a letter. Hand-delivered to my building's front desk by a courier who signed nothing and left no number. The envelope was cream, the paper heavy, the return address a legal firm I had never heard of, with offices listed in 3 cities, none of which were in this state. My name was on the front in a handwriting I did not recognize yet. I set it on the kitchen counter and looked at it for approximately 40 minutes before I opened it. Later, I would understand that 40 minutes was about 39 minutes longer than it deserved, because the letter itself was almost nothing. A single paragraph informing me that a representative of the Vrain estate wished to meet at my earliest convenience to discuss certain matters pertaining to a recently executed service agreement. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday at a downtown office that existed exactly as advertised. Glass lobby, security desk, a paralegal who offered me water and asked me to wait. The lawyer who eventually appeared was a man named Gereth, 50s, gray at the temples, with the particular patience of someone who has had this conversation before and knows exactly how it ends. He did not introduce himself as working for Vrain. He introduced himself as representing the estate of a private trust and said that he had been asked to present me with a document relevant to the service engagement I had recently completed. He set a folder on the table between us. He opened it. And there was my name, not typed, not printed, but written by hand in the same deliberate cursive I had seen on 3 of the photographs on the locked room's wall, the ones labeled with dates, the ones I had not been able to explain. I asked him where the document had come from. He said it had been prepared as part of the original service agreement. I told him I had read the original service agreement twice, and that it contained no provision referencing a secondary instrument. He said that was correct. He said the secondary instrument was not part of the original agreement. He said it had been prepared in anticipation of the original agreement's completion and that its execution had been contingent on my completing the night in the locked room and accepting the payment. He said both conditions had been met. He said the document was therefore now in effect. He said this the way someone says the weather is going to change, not as a threat, just as a fact the world had already decided on without asking me. I read the document. It took me a long time because I kept having to go back and reread sections that seemed to mean one thing, and then, on rereading, meant something else entirely. The language was precise in the way of old legal instruments, not the modern plain English contracts I was used to, but something denser, clause nested inside clause, definitions that redefine their own terms 3 paragraphs later. What I eventually understood, what I assembled from the language the way you assemble something from parts that don't quite fit, was this. By accepting the $50,000 payment for the night in the locked room, I had acknowledged receipt of an advance against a larger obligation. The obligation was described as ongoing documentation and witness services for properties and holdings managed under the Vrain Trust. The term was not specified. The compensation structure referenced a schedule that was attached as Exhibit C, which Gereth had not included in the folder. I asked for Exhibit C. Gereth said it would be provided upon execution. I asked what happened if I declined to execute. He said that declining to execute did not void the obligation. It simply placed the obligation in an unresolved status, which would initiate a default review. I asked what a default review entailed. He opened a second folder. Inside was a printout of my finances, not a credit report, not a summary, but a detailed and apparently current accounting of every account, every debt, every outstanding obligation I carried. The second mortgage, a medical bill from 18 months ago I had thought was in collections, a business loan with a personal guarantee I had co-signed for someone who had since stopped paying it. He did not say anything. He set the folder on the table and let me look at it, which I understood was the point. I left without signing. I want to be clear about that. I left without signing, which felt like something at the time. I walked back through the glass lobby and out onto the street and stood in the afternoon light and breathed. I called my own lawyer, a friend from college who handled mostly contract and IP work and who listened to everything I said and was quiet for a long time and then told me two things. First, the document I had described sounded, from what I was telling him, enforceable. Not definitely, but possibly, depending on the jurisdiction and the specific language of the original agreement I had signed. Second, fighting it, if it came to that, would cost more than I had. He said he was sorry. He said these things happened sometimes with private trusts that had sophisticated legal teams, and he said he would look at it if I sent him the documents, but that he wanted me to understand what I was walking into before I did. I thanked him and stood on the sidewalk for a while longer and watched the traffic and tried to think. That night I went through everything I had kept from the locked room, the photographs on my camera, the voice recorder, the notes I had taken. I had not looked at them since I got back. I had told myself I was processing, which was true, but I was also afraid of what careful looking would show me. I started with the photographs of the wall, the ones I had labeled and documented, face by face and date by date. I had 47 images from the wall. I went through them slowly, one by one, on the large monitor, full resolution, and somewhere around the 30th image, I stopped. Because in the lower right quadrant of that photograph, in a section I had not focused on, in a space between two framed images that I had cataloged as a gap, there was a document pinned to the wall that I had not recorded, a single page. And even at this distance, at this resolution, I could read the first line of it. It had my name on it, and the date on it was 6 weeks before I had ever heard of Aldous Vrain. I sat with that for a long time. 6 weeks before I had called Vrain's number. 6 weeks before I had even seen the listing that had led me to the property. My name had been on a document pinned to the wall of that room, which meant one of two things. Either someone had placed it there after I arrived and I had simply missed it, or it had been there before I came. The first explanation required a level of carelessness on my part that I did not want to believe. The second required a level of foreknowledge on Vrain's part that I did not want to think about. I went back through the earlier photographs, the ones I had taken in the first hour, before I had made my systematic pass. And in one of them, blurred, incidental, captured while I was photographing something else, the lower right corner of the wall was visible, and the document was there, which meant it had been there from the beginning, which meant she had known I was coming before I did. I thought about what that meant for days. Not what it meant in a legal sense, the document, the obligation, the default review, but what it meant about the nature of what had happened to me. Because if the document predated my involvement, then the locked room had not been a spontaneous arrangement. It had been prepared for me specifically. The questions Vrain had asked during our initial call, the ones I had taken as standard client intake, were something else now when I replayed them. She had asked about my work history, yes, but she had also asked about my family, phrased as small talk. She had asked whether I had partners on projects, framed as logistics. She had asked once whether I was the sort of person who finished what he started, and I had laughed it off as eccentric personality. I had given her everything she needed, and I had handed it over cheerfully because I had been in debt and the money had been real, and I had not been looking for a trap because I had needed it not to be one. I went back to Gereth's office on a Thursday. I did not have an appointment. The paralegal told me he was with a client, and I said I would wait, and I sat in the reception area for an hour and 20 minutes before he appeared. He did not seem surprised to see me. He asked if I wanted to come back to the conference room, and I said yes, and we sat down, and he set his hands flat on the table and looked at me and waited. I told him I wanted to see the document that had been on the wall of the room before I arrived. He said he didn't know what I was referring to. I said I had a photograph of it. He said he would be happy to look at the photograph. I put my phone on the table with the image pulled up. He looked at it for a moment. He said that that document was part of the preparation process for a standard engagement. He said it did not represent anything outside the scope of the instrument he had already presented. He said it in the tone of someone explaining something obvious, which told me he had expected this moment. I asked him who else had been in the room before me. He said that was not information he was authorized to share. I asked how many people had signed the secondary instrument. He said the trust's holdings and operations were confidential. I asked whether any of them had declined. He was quiet for a moment. Not a long moment, a precise one, the kind that is measured. And he said that the instrument had a very high completion rate and that this was in part because it was structured to be, as he put it, very difficult to walk away from. He used that phrase, very difficult to walk away from, not as a warning, but as a selling point, as if difficulty was a feature, as if the trap was something to be proud of. And sitting there across from him, I understood something I had been circling for a week. This was not unusual for them. This was procedure. I was not the first. I was not the exception. I was one entry in a long series of entries, and the room had been waiting for me the way a room waits, without urgency, without doubt, because rooms do not need to chase you. I drove out to the property. I do not entirely know why. It was impulse, or something that presents as impulse but is probably something else. The need to look at a thing directly when it has been abstract too long. It was a 2-hour drive, and I made it in the early evening and arrived as the last light was leaving the sky. The building was dark. The lot was empty. The chain was on the gate, and I stood at the fence and looked at the structure and thought about the room inside it. The sealed chamber with the cot and the photographs and the document that had my name on it 6 weeks before I existed to Aldous Vrain. I thought about the other names on those photographs, the ones with dates. I had assumed they were previous occupants of the land, or images from some archive, or part of an eccentric collection. Standing at the fence in the dark, it occurred to me that some of those names might belong to people who had done exactly what I had done and then found themselves exactly where I was. I called Aldous Vrain that night from the car in the empty lot. I had the number from the original engagement. It rang 4 times, and I was preparing for voicemail when she answered. She said my name before I said anything, not as a greeting, as a statement, the way you acknowledge something that has arrived on schedule. I said I had spoken to Gereth. She said she knew. I said I had questions. She said she would prefer to meet in person if I was willing, and that she understood if I was not, but that there were things the instrument did not fully capture, and she thought I would find the context useful. She said this without any urgency or persuasion in her voice. She said it the way you say the door is open, not pushing, just noting. I asked her where. She named a town 2 hours north. She named a restaurant and a time 3 days away. I wrote both down. I sat in the dark lot for a long time after I ended the call and looked at the building, and then I drove home. I went to the meeting. I want to say I went because I was gathering information, and that is partly true. But the fuller truth is that I went because the alternative, not going, felt like standing in rising water and deciding not to move. Inaction had its own cost, and I was tired of paying it blind. The restaurant was a quiet place in a small town, the kind that looks the same at lunch as it does at dinner. Not much natural light, wood paneling, a few other tables with other people. Vrain was already seated when I arrived. She looked the same as she had at the property. That same, composed, unhurried quality, dressed simply, no jewelry I could identify. She had ordered tea. There was a second cup on the table, already poured, which she had presumed to do, and which I drank anyway because I was cold from the drive, and because refusing it felt like a gesture that would cost me more than it saved. She did not begin with the document or the obligation or the legal structure. She began by asking me what I had felt in the room, not what I had seen, what I had felt. I told her that was not a question I was there to answer, and she nodded as if she had expected that and said she understood, and then she told me anyway, told me what the room does, in her phrasing. She said the room is a calibration instrument. She said it measures a particular quality that she had spent a long time learning to identify, and that she had not found reliable ways to screen for in advance, which was why the engagement structure had evolved the way it had. She said the quality was difficult to name precisely, but that the closest she had come was a combination of attention and endurance and what she called a tolerance for the unresolved. She said people with that quality were rare, and that when they completed the night, the room confirmed it in ways she had learned to document. She said I had it. She said she had suspected I had it before I arrived, which was why the document had been prepared. I asked her what the room confirms specifically. She was quiet for a moment in that precise way she had, and then she said that you can be present with something you cannot explain and not require it to resolve. She said most people in the room spend the night looking for the mechanism, looking for the explanation, the trick, the logical scaffolding that would make the experience ordinary. She said the room confounds that impulse. She did not say how, and I did not ask, and that when someone reaches morning without that impulse having destroyed them, it means something. I asked what it meant. She said it meant they were suited for the work. I asked what the work was. She said, documentation, witness, being present with things that do not resolve and recording them faithfully without imposing an explanation. She said the properties under the trust's management required that kind of witness, and that finding one was, in her experience, the hardest part of the operation. I asked her what the properties were. She described them in a way that was specific and not specific at the same time. She named categories rather than locations. Structures with unusual histories. Land with documented anomalous events. Sites that had been reported on in regional records and then quietly closed. She said the trust had been acquiring such properties for a long time, and that the documentation had begun as a private archive and had grown into something larger. She said there were 43 active sites currently under the trust's holdings. She said 12 of them required ongoing witness, someone physically present on a recurring schedule, documenting what was observable, recording without editorializing. She said the schedule and the compensation were outlined in Exhibit C, which she produced from a bag at her feet and set on the table between us. She had brought it. She had brought it to the restaurant, which meant she had not doubted I would come. I picked it up and read it without saying anything. The compensation was significant. The schedule was monthly, site by site, structured over 5 years. I asked her whether the people in the photographs, the ones on the wall, had been her previous witnesses. She looked at me across the table and said yes. I asked where they were now. She said that some had completed their terms. I asked about the others. She said some had chosen not to complete their terms. I asked what that meant. She said, default review. She said it in the same tone Gereth had used, which told me it had been rehearsed, which told me it had been said before. I asked if any of them had simply walked away and stayed away, legal consequences or not. She thought about this, or appeared to. Then she said, not permanently. She said it quietly and without elaboration and left it sitting on the table between us like something she did not need to press because the weight of it was sufficient. I looked at the compensation schedule and then I looked at my own reflection in the dark window at the back of the room, and the reflection looked like someone who had already decided. I signed the new instrument that evening, not at the restaurant but at Gereth's office. Vrain had called ahead, apparently, because Gereth was there when we arrived and the conference room was prepared and the notary was already present. I signed in 4 places. I initialed 7. Gereth witnessed. The notary stamped. Vrain did not watch while I signed, which I later thought was the most unsettling thing about the evening. She sat in the lobby and waited, and when it was done she came in and collected her copy of the document and put it in the same bag she had carried the schedule in, and she said thank you and shook my hand and left. No ceremony, no speech, no explanation of what came next. She had gotten what she came for, and she had walked out into the night, and that was all. I sat in the conference room after she left, the executed document in front of me, my initials on every page, and I thought about the $50,000 that had started this and how very far away it seemed now. The first assignment came 10 days later. A file arrived by courier. Again, no return address, same heavy cream paper. Inside was a site brief, an address in rural Wisconsin, a property description, a list of documented prior observations going back to 1981, and a schedule for my first visit. 14 days out. The brief was specific about what I was to document: any observable changes to the structure's interior since the last witness visit, any auditory events, any evidence of occupancy or approach, any changes to the collection maintained on site. It used the word collection without explaining what the collection was. It used the word witness 3 times in 4 paragraphs. Attached to the back of the brief was a single photograph of the property: a low farmhouse, late afternoon light, a tree line behind it. On the back of the photograph, in Vrain's handwriting, I recognized it now from the document on the wall. A single line: it remembers the ones it has seen. I have thought since then about what it means to become complicit in something. There is a version of that word that implies active participation, choosing to do a harm, knowing it is harm, and doing it anyway. But there is another version, quieter and I think more common, where complicity is simply the accumulation of small reasonable decisions made under pressure, each one justifiable at the time, until the sum of them has carried you somewhere you would never have chosen to go directly. I had not chosen to be Aldous Vrain's witness. I had chosen to take a job I needed. I had chosen to document rather than destroy. I had chosen to open the letter rather than ignore it. I had chosen to go to Gereth's office. I had chosen to drive to the property. I had chosen to call her number. I had chosen to go to the restaurant and to pick up Exhibit C and to read it and to not put it down. Each choice had been, in itself, survivable. The architecture of the trap was made of survivable choices. That was the design. That had always been the design. I drove to Wisconsin on a Tuesday in November. The farmhouse was exactly as the photograph had shown it: low, pale, a tree line that pressed closer to the structure than trees typically grow when no one is managing their approach. The key had been in the file. The door opened without resistance. The interior was cold, as if the heating had been off for some time, and it smelled of paper and something else underneath that I categorized and moved past. There was a room off the main hallway. The door was closed. On the door, in that same deliberate cursive, was a single word: collection. I opened the door. What was inside I will describe in detail in the pages that follow, because description is the work, and I signed to do the work, and I intend to be accurate. But I will say first, before I describe anything, that I stood in the doorway for a long time and understood something. This was not the worst of the 43 properties. This was the first one. She had started me here, which told me something about what was coming. She had wanted me to understand what I had agreed to, slowly, one site at a time. The collection was photographs, hundreds of them. The same format, the same framing as the room I had spent the night in, but larger in number and organized with more system. Each image was labeled. Each label included a name, a date, and a location. The photographs were not of people, not exactly. They were of places, but each place had been documented at a moment when the place was not empty, and the evidence of presence was always on the edge of the frame: a shadow, a shape in a window, a disturbance in water or grass or snow. Someone had been to each of these sites and documented something that was there and then was not. I spent 4 hours in that room. I photographed everything with the systematic protocol I had developed in the first locked room. I recorded, I cataloged, I did not impose an explanation. When I was done, I locked the door behind me and drove back in the dark and did not stop until I was home. I sent the documentation to an address in the file. I received a confirmation in return, a brief note, same handwriting, that said, "Good. Next site in 3 weeks." I have done this now for long enough that it is, in most of its daily texture, simply work. There is a discipline to documentation when you do it correctly, and discipline has its own rhythm, and rhythm is survivable. I go to the sites, I observe, I record, I send the documentation, I receive the next brief. The compensation clears on the 1st of each month, and the second mortgage is no longer a thing I think about, and the medical debt is gone and the co-signed loan has been quietly resolved in ways I did not ask about, and probably should not know. This is the shape that a trap takes when it is well made. It becomes, over time, a life. Not the life you would have chosen, but livable, functional. The thing I keep returning to, the question I cannot set down, is this: how many of the people in those photographs are doing the same thing I am doing right now? Not the places in the images, not the shadows at the edge of frames, but the people who took the photographs. How many of them drove home in the dark and sent a file and received a confirmation and did it again? There is a new brief on my table tonight, the next site. I have not opened it yet. I make a point of letting the envelope sit for one evening before I open it. Not because it changes anything, but because it is the last decision in the sequence that is still entirely mine. Everything after the opening is procedure, but the moment before, the envelope still sealed, is mine. I sit with my coffee and I look at it, and I think about the person who will show up at that site in 3 weeks, key in hand, and I think about whether that person is still someone I recognize. The honest answer, which I have arrived at slowly and not without some difficulty, is mostly. Mostly, I recognize him. He is careful. He is accurate. He does not impose explanations. He finishes what he starts. These are not the worst things to be. They were not the things I was before. But they are, it turns out, the things the room was always making. And the room, it seems, knew what it was doing long before I walked through the door. If the money had never been real, would you have opened the letter at all?